about to start. Good evening. Welcome to this national premiere of the film Gaza Journalists Under Fire, produced by Brave New Films and filmmaker Robert Greenwald. My name is Tamara Kharroub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to this film screening and the discussion that will take place after. Today's event is co-sponsored by 3 organizations: the film producers, Brave New Films, and filmmaker Robert Greenwald have a long-standing legacy of producing hard-hitting investigative documentaries that expose injustice, put a face on policy, and drive social change. The second co-sponsor is Arab Center, Washington, D.C., which is a think tank research organization focusing on the study of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, with a special attention to issues of human rights, democratic principles, and just and peaceful resolution to conflict. The National Writers Union is also a co-sponsor, which is a trade union for freelance and contract writers with a 43-year history fighting for the rights of creative workers and standing in solidarity with journalists abroad, including in Gaza. Thanks to everyone at those 3 organizations who helped make this event happen, and thanks to Busboys and Poets for hosting us. The film, Gaza Journalists Under Fire, tells the story of 3 of the journalists killed by the Israeli army while covering the genocide in Gaza: Bilal Jadallah, Hiba al-Abadla, and Ismail al-Ghul. Since the start of the war on Gaza in October 2023, more than 187 journalists and media workers have been killed by Israel, making it the deadliest conflict for journalists ever recorded. Despite the overwhelming evidence of deliberate targeting of Palestinian journalists and the disregard for Palestinian life and human rights and humanitarian law, Israel and its military continue without accountability. Through the stories of these 3 journalists who were killed, the film chronicles the genocide in Gaza and documents the blatant targeting of civilians, as well as media, health, and humanitarian workers. With input from leading human rights organizations, the film addresses the grave violations of international law committed in Gaza over the past almost 20 months. This film is 40 minutes long, and the screening today will be followed by a discussion with some of the experts in those fields. We will focus on issues like press freedom and the protection of journalists in Palestine and elsewhere, the media coverage of the war on Gaza, violations of international law and international humanitarian law in Gaza, and the role of the international community in protecting journalists and civilians, as well as implications for U.S. policy and U.S. aid to Israel. Without further ado, the national premiere of the film, Gaza Journalists Under Fire. Hello again. Thank you for staying for the discussion. Let me start by introducing our panelists here and thanking them for being with us today and for providing your insights and reactions. I will briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Sharif Mansour is the Outreach and Distribution Coordinator at Brave New Films. Rana Natour is an award-winning journalist and correspondent. And Phyllis Bennis is Program Director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, among many other things. Thank you all for being here and for joining us in this discussion. Before we start, I also want to draw your attention to the question cards that you have in front of you. If you feel like asking a question, please use those cards and flag anybody to collect the card from you. So after watching these stories of Bilal, Hiba, and Ismail, and many, many more, and watching a live stream genocide for almost 20 months now on our phone screens, I think the significance of this film is not only in showcasing and highlighting the stories of the Palestinians in Gaza that the legacy and mainstream media has failed to show, and the humanity of the Palestinians, which is often neglected and undermined, but also in documenting the genocide and documenting the international reactions and the growing global movement against the genocide, against the war, and against Israeli occupation and apartheid. And I would like to begin with asking the panelists the first round of questions, just your initial reaction to this film after watching it, and what do you think the significance of having a film like this? I will start with Sharif.
This film was started as an idea with Robert Greenwald, the director, who told me and many of the people involved in the team that he, as a Jewish American, felt responsible and felt that it was morally imperative for him to speak up. This is what he did in similar situation of abuse of power where victims cannot get accountability. The Brave New Film have done similar projects to expose sexual harassment, to expose election fraud, and even to expose the bias and complicity of mainstream media, including Fox News earlier in its days. This all had the hallmarks of why Brave New Film started this project. A few things Robert told me to ask you to do today, and this is one of the philosophy behind the film, is it's aimed for action. The film is made because of asking people to take action. It's done and being presented for free. There is no tickets, and it will be available online at a later point for people to screen it. Everyone in this room can sign up to receive a full version of the film in English today. It's on the website. And we encourage all of you to use the film for your own purposes, for your own advocacy, for your own fundraising, to amplify the voices of people like these three journalists featured in the film, journalists who are paying the price every day in Gaza, and also to amplify the demand of the families, the colleagues of the journalists for justice. We urge you to support financially press freedom groups like Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, but most importantly, Palestinian journalist protection groups, including the two partners that we saw in the film, the colleagues of Bilal Jadallah in the Gaza Press House, the colleagues of Hiba Al-Abadla in the Social Media Club, and many others who are advocating and standing up to call for justice and to call for ending the uncritical support of the US government in this genocide led by the Israeli army in Gaza. I would also be remiss that this is a fight against censorship. And as we speak right now, the film's ad have been rejected by Meta and Facebook and Instagram. So help spread the word by sharing the trail of the promo, spread it on social media, and host a gathering like this for people to watch the film. I'm going to stop here and allow others to take a stab at the first question.
Can I get the microphone back? Thank you, Sharif. And I would like to move to Rana next and get your reactions to the film and why you think this film is important to show.
Well, I don't think, can you guys hear me? Is it on? Hello? I don't think a minute 50 package, a news package can adequately convey the level of loss and who these people are and what they meant to people in Gaza. I mean, even when you saw the young boy go up to Ismail al-Ghul, he called him by his first name. He knows him, and Ismail knows, they know each other. He is from the community, and you can just hear the trauma in the man's voice as he approaches the car, realizing that it is the journalist Ismail al-Ghul. These are figures that these people have lived with and followed for a long time. And, it's not just people, it's the eradication. I mean, I think the film said 70 press facilities. The press house was destroyed. Places that would distribute press vests. I mean, it's a wholesale destruction. I mean, as bad as the numbers are, we also need to understand how small Gaza is. It's the size of DC, it's Philadelphia. Kiev in Ukraine is twice as big as Gaza. And as many journalists haven't been killed in Ukraine anywhere near what's been in Gaza. So as bad as it is, it's worse than the numbers. So I think it's important. I don't think enough films can be made about that because these people aren't coming back. There's an entire generation that has been slaughtered. With it, their media, their stories, their talent. It takes years to develop the kind of talent that we saw on that screen.
Thank you, Rana. And the same question to you, Phyllis.
Thank you, and thanks for your work on the film, and thanks for bringing it to all of us. This is a hard film to watch. It's painful, it's powerful, and we have to be very careful not to let it make us feel hopeless and unable to fight back. When I watched the film this afternoon, thinking I would prepare for it a bit, I realized that the number of journalists that are documented in the film, I think it's 173, is way behind. There's now been 50 more. When I looked it up this morning, it was 220 journalists and media workers who have been killed so far in Gaza. That's about more than one every 3 days. When I traveled in Palestine for the first time during the first Intifada, my partner, my work partner, was a photographer. We were doing a book together, and he was the first foreign journalist to be shot in Nablus, in Palestine at the time. He was very lucky. He was shot in the leg. He was fine after treatment. But it was a very big deal, a foreign journalist shot. Now, we're seeing journalists shot and killed on a daily basis, funded by those foreign governments, particularly our own, that have made this genocide possible. It's an entirely different world. I was looking also at the numbers. We're talking numbers tonight, not just numbers of people killed, but the amount of money. The $17.9 billion that the US gave to Israel just last year, just in that 1 year, paying 40% of Israel's entire military aid budget. Here's what it could have paid for if it did not go towards a genocide. 725,000 people getting health care and 92,000 four-year foreign college scholarships and 280,000 slots in Head Start for poor children and 211,000 veterans getting good medical care and 37,000 elementary school teachers being hired for a year. What makes us safer? What makes Israelis and anyone else safer when we look at how the money is being spent? We're told that there's no money for healthcare and jobs and medical care and childcare and education here because we have to give tax cuts to the rich, and too few of our members of Congress and too few of us, I'm afraid, in our movements are saying that it's also because of the money going to the military. That is where it's going, what we saw here tonight. That's what that money goes for. It goes to the Pentagon. It doesn't go to heroic soldiers from the United States marching around on parades on Constitution Avenue. Well, some of it will. But most of it goes to killing people. That's what we saw. It's our money, our tax money that we are seeing. And the last thing I want to just say is that when we think about what we need to be fighting for in the context of all of this, it's very complicated because we really have the potential for an extraordinarily broad movement, the ceasefire movement that erupted within days of this genocide beginning, which was very different than the Palestinian rights movement that has been around for 25, 30, 35 years. Much broader, much bigger, maybe not as deep, but much broader and operating much closer to power than our movement was ever able to. And one of the things that means is that we're part of a global movement now. I just came back from a week at the UN where we were pushing members of missions at the UN, about a dozen of them, 10, 11, I think, pushing them on three things. Number one, an arms embargo. Our country provides 68% of the weapons that Israel uses. We need a global arms embargo just like we had for apartheid South Africa. And we need to stop Israel from being able to speak and vote in the General Assembly. The Assembly can do that without the Security Council, without worrying about a US veto. And we need the reopening of the Center Against Apartheid and the Special Committee Against Apartheid of the United Nations. All of those things are things we have to start talking about so that our friends and colleagues and comrades around the world start demanding that of their own governments, who ultimately, when they start to impose sanctions on Israel, it will be the same as what happened when we finally got sanctions against apartheid South Africa. That's the goal. And it's a long struggle ahead, and we don't have a long time, because this is what is happening on a daily basis. So we have to do both. We have to have that long-term vision, and we have to fight right now to change it right now.
Thank you, Phyllis. And I would like to go back to Sharif now for a little bit. I know you talked about the film, but can you tell us a little more about how this film came about, especially choosing the 3 journalists that were killed by Israel? And I think you have to use this microphone.
I think this one might, maybe turn it on. I'm not sure it's on.
Go ahead, Sharif. Let's try the microphone.
Hello?
No.
Okay.
There's a
We have 3 useless microphones.
Thank you. I joined Brave New Films 2 months ago. They were already at the editing stage. Since I joined, I was doing distribution and outreach on their behalf. But the content itself, it came from those journalists' own work as journalists. And the difference I think the director makes is that he humanizes the stories by starting way before their killing, to put their life in context, to put them with their families, so that the viewer can actually relate and sympathize a lot more than many of the mainstream arts community and media community are treating the war in Gaza. So the 3 cases basically represent, at a certain point, the work that was done by independent, local Palestinian journalists. There was Al Jazeera journalist, but we also worked with Al Jazeera to try to highlight their story. They provided some of the footage, and the families and the press freedom groups provided some of the footage as follow-up, in addition to the ones that the journalists themselves produced and made available online on social media. Now, when we say at the beginning that the goal was to put a face on a policy, that is what the trajectory of the story, by picking each case individually and making it a standalone call for action. So each of those stories, once you learn about them, you learn about their family and their work, there is a follow-up immediately demanding one action to be done in terms of accountability. I want to also say that big part of why this is different is that it was released first in Palestine on Sunday, on air, in person, and online. The two partners group in Gaza, the surviving colleagues of the journalists, showed up in person, 25 of them, and also made a Zoom release of the film online. And even though we've agreed that we're going to do it just virtually, people couldn't miss the chance to go in person, make copies of the actual file so that they can share it with their friends, their family, because there may not be another chance to get electricity or to get an internet connection. I'm also thankful for dozens more who've shown up in screenings in person in the Palestinian Red Crescent in Nablus, along with our partner Palestinians. Many of them were women journalists from the occupied territories who came together for the screening and talked to the media, local media, about their impressions and how appreciative they were that it first came to them to be shown before it was shown in Washington. Lastly, I want to say that we are trying to reach also partners in Israel, and next week we are starting the premieres in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, along with partners who are also speaking up and taking a risk to showing this film in Israel, including Culture of Solidarity, House of Solidarity, including House Radical or Beit Radical, including Amal student group, and Standing Together and others who over the course of next month will also show this film in Hebrew and presented in Hebrew media.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharif. Rana, we're talking about the deliberate targeting of journalists by Israel and the failure to protect journalists, not only by Israel, but by the world. In your assessment, how can we get accountability for those killings?
Well, I'm gonna speak about U.S. media outlets because that's my experience. But and I say this as someone who's working with U.S. media outlets, who has. But major U.S. media outlets have completely failed to meet this moment in every single way, at every step of the way. We knew within a month of this war that it was going to be something that we've never seen, that Gaza has never seen before. And we knew, and all of these outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, knew that Israel was barring international journalists from covering Israel. Well, if that becomes the way of the world, then that's the end of conflict reporting, really, as we know it. They should have and could have done so much more, because that decision opened the door for the next thing that happened, the systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists, because the only journalists that were there to target was Palestinian journalists. New York Times could have took a front page ad and made their front page blank and said, the reason this is blank, folks, is because we cannot cover the war in Gaza. CNN could have had a 10 seconds of black with an anchor intro saying, we can't show you the news in Gaza because our journalists aren't allowed to go there. Washington Post could have had a running tally of the number of journalists that have died in Gaza as a banner on their homepage. All of this could have been done, and it can be done today. There was a decision not to do that. And when it comes to the killing of journalists, there's a quote. I saw it on CNN, and it wasn't talking about this, but I think it helps to kind of ground this discussion. There's a Libyan American novelist and essayist, Hisham Mata, that said something that really, for me, was very eye-opening. And what he said is that there's something about emergencies, because in a state of emergencies, in a state of emergency, there's also a state of emergence. Things come to the surface, the mask has been dropped. And for me, that mask and the thing that came to the surface is that the fundamental tenets that I was taught in newsroom of what journalism is and what our job is, journalism is not a crime. Journalism shouldn't be a death sentence, that our job is to speak power, truth to power, and to hold that accountable. Objectivity, what does objectivity look like? What standards am I being held to as a journalist of being objective? Well, it was built and created for a certain type of journalist. It wasn't actually created for journalists en masse. When they were thinking of speaking truth to power and what that looks like and objectivity, they were thinking of, an American journalist for a major media outlet in Russia, or an intrepid foreign correspondent in Syria. They were thinking of, when it comes to objectivity, of a journalist who is not from either country that are fighting in a war, that is coming from outside, covering that and then going home. Well, how objective do you want a journalist to be when they're from the region that is being occupied and their family is being killed? I mean, that's not a reasonable level of objectivity. It's not a reasonable expectation. That doesn't mean they're not journalists. It doesn't mean that they are not reporting from the ground. And all of these outlets, they're collecting the videos of these journalists, they're collecting the dispatches of these journalists, yet they're not even mourning their deaths. It's just really hypocritical and terrible. And I think it's, for all of us in this room, we're watching what's happening, and it's really created some profound change. But I think, what privilege is being able to walk away unscathed. And I think for a lot of people, even other journalists, it's not registering in their mind. And I think that's really disappointing. Even with how journalists are covering the student protests, there was a Columbia journalism professor, her name is Azmat Khan, and she was speaking to some of these journalists, and she was running through all the videos that we've all seen that we can think of, Hind Rajab's voice on the line, speaking to the equivalent of 911 operators, basically, the silhouetted girl just a few days ago behind a fire. All of these videos run through our mind. The journalists who were covering those student protests didn't recognize a single one. And as someone who covered protests, if I'm out there on Tahrir Square covering what's happening on all the protests, if I can't recognize what is driving protesters to the streets, then I'm not doing my job. My editors would take me back from my assignment and give me a talking to, right? That's not happening. All of these people are doing basically lazy journalism. That is a friendly way of saying it. And a real way of saying it is basically journalistic malpractice. I mean, you don't even know your beat on a fundamental level in some of these cases. So I think what's happening is these outlets are getting outscooped. Other outlets are coming right behind them, and they're covering stories in a way that people want them covered. Instead of going to their homepages, new outlets are popping up that didn't feel the need to exist before. People are turning to influencers on Instagram and TikTok, and people are turning to these journalists that we saw that are since deceased, but their work is going to live on. So I think there needs to be a reckoning. I don't think that there will be one, and I think it's journalists who don't look like me that are going to push it, because they're not going to be accused of being too emotional about it, even though I don't think I am. I think I'm just speaking facts here. But I don't think these outlets recognized when they were talking about speaking truth to power that power would be them. people they knew, their bosses, their colleagues, strangers on the internet, trying to assassinate them professionally so they couldn't do their job. I don't think they thought that it would be so close to home and to their own values that they have to recalibrate and think about. But it's our job. And another thing is, this is a very tired playbook. What's the best way to target journalists systematically if you're a country, any country, is to convince the world that they're not journalists at all. They're Hamas operatives, they're spies, they're militants. I mean, that's what you're going to do. You're not going to announce that you're killing journalists because they're relaying information you don't want. You're going to accuse them of being other things. And to parrot that and to not make sure that your headline doesn't reflect that it's ridiculous it's just not good journalism. So I think that's what we're saying.
Thank you, Rana, for bringing this important point up. The issue of accountability has many aspects, and one of them is the legacy mainstream media, especially in this country, which has failed its journalistic duties and ethics, and in essence has enabled and justified and whitewashed Israeli crimes for the past 20 months. And when we're talking about accountability, I want to go back to you, Phyllis. You talked about the role of the United States and U.S. aid. What other roles in terms of political cover, diplomatic cover, has the U.S. Given to enable the continuation of this genocide?
Sending arms to any country that is not using them solely for self-defense, that has any units within its military that are known to be committing grave breaches of human rights. There's there's the Leahy laws, there's the Arms Export Control Act, there's a series of them, there's 4 or 5 of them with different restrictions. But the goal of all of them is to prevent this, to prevent our weapons, our tax money from going to create a genocide. And the question of accountability is the fundamental weakness in some ways of the international system as well as the national system. We know from people who have resigned in protest from the State Department that the mechanisms that are in place, the institutional mechanisms that are designed to prevent weapon sales from being approved is ignored when it comes to Israel. It's very official, it's open, it's not hidden. There's a separate process with 2 separate staffers who are in charge of approving arms to Israel, different than everybody else, than all the other countries in the world. And on a global level, we see the same thing because of the role of the United States. So in the Security Council of the United Nations, where there is the most power within the UN, it's the least democratic, but the most powerful part of the UN. The US has a veto, and it uses it with a vengeance. It used its veto, if you look at the period between 1970 and now, 1/3 of all US vetoes were cast to prevent the UN from imposing sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Half were used, and it continues to be, to prevent the UN from imposing sanctions on apartheid Israel. So whatever that is, that's 3/6 and 2/6, 5/6 of US vetoes since 1970 have been used to prevent holding accountable those who perpetuate apartheid, wherever it may happen. So that's what we're seeing. But there's a new component right now. There's a new kid on the block. The International Court of Justice and South Africa have played an extraordinary role, beginning just in the first month after the genocide began in this round of genocide in Gaza. Because what happened was South Africa made the decision very bravely, particularly now given the kind of pressure and attacks they're facing from the US government on economic issues, aid, trade, all of those things. But they made the decision that it was no longer acceptable to see the world court, the most important, most powerful court in the world, as something that was nothing more than an instrument of the white colonial countries. That they, as an African country, as part of the global South, had every right to go to that institution and say, We are bringing charges against one of the closest allies of the most powerful Western colonial country in the world, the United States. We are going to bring charges against Israel. And the court did not say, oh, that's ridiculous, we'll see you somewhere other time. They said, okay, that's what we're here for. And despite the fact that it took a long time, it was shorter than any other example of the court making a preliminary ruling, held Israel accountable for plausibly committing genocide, and ordered them in 6 specific orders, and then 5 more, and then 4 more after that, to do a whole bunch of things that amounted to a ceasefire, although they didn't use that word. Now, the problem is, of course, the decisions of the International Court of Justice are enforceable. They are considered international law. But like the Pope in the famous saying, you know, when people say, well, yeah, but how many military forces does the Pope have? How many military forces does the International Court of Justice have? 0. They not only don't have an army, they don't even have a police force, they don't even have a process server to go around the world and sort of hand out the information. What they do have is us, civil society all around the world, whose job it is now to follow the model of what was done around South Africa in the 1980s, getting countries around the world to start imposing sanctions, arms embargoes, trade embargoes, banking sanctions, stop diplomatic relations, all those things with Israel. Eventually, enough countries will do that the US will be forced to do it because it's become too isolated not to. And the cost for not doing it becomes greater than the cost of doing it. That's the goal. The challenge we face is we don't have the time that we did in apartheid, as horrific as apartheid was for the Black South African majority. People were not being slaughtered in the streets on a daily basis. It happened. The uprising in Soweto, the Sharpeville massacre, where people were slaughtered in the streets. But it did not happen for 20 months, day after day after day after day. We don't have the time. And that's the challenge. We don't have a strategy for how to move fast enough to answer this moment's crisis. And yet we have to move with what we have. So that means working globally on getting other countries to move fast, because some of them are. Colombia has stopped sending coal to Israel that it uses to fuel its military. South Africa, as we said, has already brought charges at the International Court of Justice and gone back to the court 3 more times to get additional forces in motion. Other countries are doing similar things. A bunch of countries are now looking to recognize Palestine as a state with full diplomatic relations at the United Nations. Now, is that going to change anything on the ground? No. But when France does it, it matters a lot. And France is on the verge of doing it. That's because Spain and Ireland and Norway did it together about a month ago. And it changed the dynamics in Europe. Right now, the European Union is reimagining and reevaluating their association accord with Israel, their trade agreement. All of that is now up for grabs around the world in a whole new way. Our country is more isolated than ever. And we know that's partly because of the current president, the current administration. But we are still here. We still are paying taxes, and those of us who are citizens are still voting or still have the right to vote, at least for the moment. So we have to fight to maintain the right to vote and then use it to change the dynamics here in Washington, in this pestilential city that's the center of so much. We are the people who can do all of those things. But it's not going to be easy. But we have to think about it in the context of we are the enforcement arm of the International Court of Justice and the General Assembly, the most democratic part of the United Nations, but not the powerful part. We are also responsible for how to enforce those resolutions. The resolutions that the GA, the General Assembly, passed last September responded to everything the International Court of Justice had demanded, for an end to the killing, an end to the famine, an end to all of these things, is now a part of the General Assembly resolution. It's our job to start enforcing it. We have a lot of work to do ahead.
Thank you, Phyllis. And in the last 3 minutes, I would like to give each of you 1 minute of closing statements. But also, I want to maybe follow up on Phyllis's statements about the power of the mass movement, the public pressure, and the influence that small and medium states in the global south or even in Europe can have outside of the constraints of the UN system. Maybe you can provide some closing remarks on what can be done at that level. We start with you, Sharif.
Thank you. I'm going to add to the civil society point because I think one of the things this movie is also calling for is building those bridges, partnerships. You hear people from the US, people who are based in Europe, people who are based in Israel, echoing very much the same demands that people in Palestine are saying, the people who are journalists are saying, and the idea that journalists are in so many ways not just civilians, but are protected. It is something that can be said, should be supported by everyone, but it's also not just journalists. And that's one of the things that movie, it's not talking about just journalists as civilians, it's talking about women, it's talking about children, and it's talking about all of them together facing hunger, facing all sorts of abuses, and not just being killed. So I think it's important that we look at civilians, all of them, including journalists, because it is one of the things that will matter for the world, the more they know. And I would end with allowing international journalists into Gaza as a demand that will make a difference. We have to end censorship that we haven't seen in any war before, by any military before. This is the complicity of Western media that should and can change right away, and it will make a lot of difference in terms of finding accountability, because it will allow the evidence, it will allow international investigators like the International Criminal Court to be able to enforce its decision, and in the public opinion, allow policymakers to make those steps, such as recognizing Palestine. Alon here.
Give the microphone to Rana.
Well, I think we're seeing people ask questions that they've never asked before, and people who, did not really think about this issue, or up until now, I know it sounds unbelievable, but even think about what's happening in Gaza. When we see people being disappeared off the streets for writing an op-ed, when we see institutions, venerated institutions, being barred from accepting student applicants wholesale, and trying to stop student visas from being issued altogether, and telling our State Department to screen people based on their values on one issue, I think people are starting to wonder, okay, this is, now that it's starting to impact me, I guess that's a selfish way of putting it, but it is true. Now that we're seeing it impact our institutions in a way I don't like, what's going on here? And I think within the media, I think there is a recognition that from many people, an increasing number of my colleagues, that we have not done enough. It's too late for that, but I think we're going to start to see a shift. I mean, already, the Overseas Press Club, for instance, renamed an award in the name of Shireen Abu Akleh. Every single award in that institution was named after a white man before that. And I think journalists within that institution started recognizing, hey, that's not the only way that you can be a journalist. You guys are defining things in a way that's not accurate, in a way that doesn't reflect this profession, in a way that doesn't adequately reflect the truth. So we are seeing a shift, and it's a powerful shift, but it's the biggest uphill battle. I think we didn't even anticipate that the institutions that are shifting and working and changing policy would do so in the way that they did. I mean, I was surprised by that. So there is going to be a shift in this country, but I think we cannot underestimate how far the powers will go to stop it. So whatever they do, I think that there needs to be a groundswell of movement in the other direction. And that is a lot of energy, and that's a lot of resources, and that's a lot of time to ask of regular people. But I have confidence that it'll happen.
I just want to maybe add one question too at the end. You've mentioned arms embargoes, and we all know that arms embargoes on Israel would end this right now. How can we achieve that? Is it feasible?
Everything is feasible. We just have to figure out new strategies to get there. I think there already has been an enormous shift in the discourse in this country, including in the media. As terrible as the mainstream media remains, it is head and shoulders above what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 20 months ago.
Yeah.
So we have to keep that in mind. You know, 77% now of Democratic voters say they want no more aid to Israel. That has never happened before. In 2021, 4 years ago, in a poll taken by the Jewish Electorate Institute, 25% of American Jewish voters said Israel is an apartheid state, and 38% of young Jews said that. We have done incredible work in this country, and what we've seen in the first 8, 9, 10 months of the genocide was an extraordinary movement that rose up really spontaneously, the ceasefire movement, that managed to do several things that our stronger movement in some ways had never been able to do, one of which was message discipline, which is something we were never very good at. But in that messaging was the demand for not just a ceasefire in the sense of stop dropping bombs, but stop sending weapons, was now included in the demand for a ceasefire among this huge, broad movement. And right now, we're not seeing that movement on its own operating in the streets. What we are seeing is that all those people, or virtually all of them, are part of the movements that we're seeing all over this country, not just in New York and Washington, but in small towns, in big cities, in rural areas, all over the country, where people are fighting back against exactly what you're talking about, the attacks on immigrants, the attacks on Harvard, the attacks on Columbia University, all of these attacks, which people across this country appropriately understand as attacks on all of us, right? That they came first for the immigrants who are supporting Palestinian rights. Then they go after the immigrants who just are immigrants. Then they start going after people with green cards. And next it's going to be American citizens. So, and people understand that trajectory. So our job, it seems to me, which is obvious and really, really hard, is to figure out how we get that big, broad movement for ceasefire, which is still needed. We still need a ceasefire, in the context of building a movement against authoritarianism and the rise of fascism in this country. How do we integrate those? We know that the question of Palestine is at the linchpin of that issue right now, but it's not necessarily on the demands in the way it needs to be. It was amazing on April 5th, when there was massive protests around the country saying hands off Social Security, hands off Medicaid, hands off Medicare, hands off Harvard. There was not a demand from the leadership saying hands off Palestine or hands off Gaza, but in virtually every one of those protests, there were people with Palestinian flags and signs saying, stop attacking Gaza, stop aid to Israel. And what was so important, they were welcomed by everybody else. Whether or not somebody called for it at the national level really didn't matter. People understood that it was central. I was on a book tour at the time. You should all see my new book, actually. It would be useful for some people. It's called Understanding Palestine and Israel. During that time, I happened to be in New Haven So on April 5th, I went to the protest in New Haven. And they didn't have a demand that said anything about Palestine or about Gaza or about aid to Israel. But there were like 4, 5, 6 different groupings within the march of people with flags and banners and posters and creative chants and wearing keffiyehs. And everybody else was coming up and saying, we're so glad you're here. We're so glad you're here. That's the essence of what movement solidarity looks like. And we need more of it. And that's what's going to make it possible to make real this public sentiment saying no more arms for Israel, to make that a law, to make it real.
Thank you, Phyllis. And on that note, we have reached the end of the time we have for today. Many thanks to the three of you, Sharif, Phyllis, and Rana, for your excellent contributions. Thank you for joining us. A special thanks to Brave New Films and Robert Greenwald for producing this film. And yes. And thanks to Arab Center Washington, D.C. and the National Writers Union for co-sponsoring this event. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a good night.
And for Bus Boys.
And thanks to Bus Boys. Absolutely.